Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel simply is Discerning What is True. Going to be reading another chapter today from the book Fundamentalism and American Culture, the shaping of the 20th century evangelicalism from 1870 to 1925. You might say, well, this is not important, but it is, because it's a different direction that the evangelical churches are involved in, and also the fundamentalists also. So we're going to kind of get into what I call explaining some things deeper, but this is about D.L. Moody. I'm sure that some of you heard of D.L. Moody, maybe, maybe not. It would only be in Christian circles, that is. So let me find the direction where I'm supposed to be at. Okay, this is also in a brief subtitle here. It says Puritan in American Babylon. So this is actually kind of key to people to understand. This is George M. Marston. This is the book I'm reading from here. It's written by Oxford Universal Press, which is in England, as well as I recollect. I did post yesterday about the whole idea of of Israel and the Revelations and all that kind of stuff, which was this particular thing here, but it's actually on my Facebook page, and how they've come up with this whole type of thinking also. But let's continue on where we're supposed to be at, and so just bear with me here. Quote, as he stood on the platform, end quote, wrote the Reverend Lyman Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, in praise of Dwight L. Moody. Quote, he looked like a businessman. He dressed like a businessman. He took the meeting in hand as a businessman would, end quote. Abbott comment, written shortly before Moody's death in 1899, points out some characteristics of Moody's revivalism that since have sometimes been obscured. Moody's evangelism had a degree of middle-class respectability about it that was not always present in American revivalism. His methods and his message sparked nothing like the fierce controversies that stalked his immediate predecessor, that is, Charles Finney, during Finney's early career. Neither did Moody's businessman style partake of the extravagant theoretical aerobatic and country yokel touch of his immediate successor, which is Billy Sunday. When I went to, I think I might have said this yesterday, maybe not, can't remember, so I'll just repeat it maybe. When I went to visit, that is the Grace Theological, that is Grace College, not Grace Theological Seminary, but Grace College in Winona Lake, Indiana, we went, that is, I was with some others, that we went to see where Billy Sunday used to preach, which was outside a building, so to speak. This is when they, this begins what we call become popular in those days, is that you had this evangelist coming through the town, and they would build a somewhat a scaffolding, but it wasn't a scaffolding, it was just a place for people to come to, and it'd be like a tent. Sometimes it'd be, today even see it sometimes like a circus tent. It's still being done, you see. But anyway, I'm digressing here. So Charles Finney. So yeah, Charles Finney was more, such and such, kind of, wing it, so to speak. But anyway, and Billy Sunday. Moody's meetings, although warmed by the informationalities of our Sankey hymn sing, were relatively decorous, sentimental rather than sensational, characterized his message. They contain, quote, as the title of a collection of his sermons advertised, that is, quote, living truths for head and heart, illustrated by thrilling anecdotes and incidents, personal experiences, touching home scenes, and stories of tender pathos, end quote. His message, aside from the constant stress on the necessity of conversion, was of the love of God. His theology, although basically orthodox, was ambiguous to the point of seeming not to be theology at all. No, it wasn't. It wasn't theology at all. That's most of these guys weren't in theology, so to speak. Like I said, he was a businessman, you see. Moody could thus maintain cordial relations with members of both emerging parties in American Protestantism. As Lyman Abbott and Henry Ward Beecher, successor and spokesman for the New Theology, put it, quote, not the least of the major services which Mr. Moody rendered to the age has been this practical demonstration that religion is more than theology, and that based upon this principle, a true Christian Catholicism is always possible, end quote. Moody's contribution to emerging fundamentalism was both large and complex. Moody was progenitor in what we call fundamentalism. It could even be argued that he was as its principal progenitor. He was a major deal here. And he was quite popular, folks, at that time. He believed in biblical infallibility and premillennialism. So this is what you always see with these guys. But you have to understand one key here. The biblical infallibility was simply is that they believed in the literal interpretation of the Bible. You see, and this is gradually going to change here, folks, because that's not true anymore, because it never was true. It's time to wake up. See, the whole idea, what they're talking about, you can nail it real quick. It simply is that well, okay. So where's history point out that Jesus was actually in Jerusalem, and there's no history that proves that. There is no historian that was there. I mean, when I mean this, if he was there would have been someone there writing it down. People say, well, it's writing down the Bible. No. You don't understand. You see, that's what people miss here. There was no historian revealing that Jesus was there in Jerusalem or anywhere else, because they're stories. That's all they are. They're stories. They're riddles. This is what people can't seem to get, because simply they've been taught to just read certain books in every way they read them, which is true in a literal perspective, but not the Bible. That's what Phil Langdon tries to share with people. And so this is the whole idea, not only that the Bible is infallible, but if Jesus was not there, repeat, was not seen in Jerusalem, such and such, then that would mean simply is he wouldn't come back here, because simply he never came in the first place. Okay. And when some people would say that's liberalism. No, it's not liberalism at all. I'm not saying the Bible's untrue. I'm not saying that. You need to understand that the Bible is true, but you're reading it wrongly. That's what you're doing. You're reading it wrongly. You're looking at it literal like every other stinking book out there. And it's not meant to be read literally. There is no Solomon and Gomorrah. There was never a David and Goliath. Those are stories. But people don't get it, do they? Well, I didn't get it neither for over 50 years of my life, more than that, because that's what I grew up in. Even went to seminary. Didn't see it, I didn't see that, but I did see something else. Didn't make any sense. His closest associates had virtually all the traits of what we call later fundamentalism, and many of them, in fact, principally directed in organizing the fundamentalist movement in the 20th century. Yet, Moody himself lacked the one trait that was what we call essential to a, quote, fundamentalist, end quote. He was unaudible, opposed to controversy. In other words, he wasn't going to get involved in controversy. That's what he was about. Moody was a pragmatic activist, determined that nothing should stand in the way of preaching the gospel effectively. Quote, couldn't they, that is critics, agree to a truce, end quote, he suggested in 1899, and for 10 years, bring out no fresh views, just to let us get on with the practical work of the kingdom, end quote. So he's definitely pragmatic. You can see that already just by that statement there. It's very practical. As best he could, he tried simply to avoid the new issues. He didn't want to deal with that. He would not get involved with that. And that would reveal something. Either he was not willing to go there, or he didn't have the ability to, quote unquote, to go there. In other words, to think about it. Okay. He had his own agenda. Okay. It's like you're having blinders on, and you have you like a horse. The horse has his agenda. I mean, not an agenda, but he's told to go this way, and you pull in such a way this way. Well, Moody didn't mess with that. If someone reported such and such, and just basically said, "Nice seeing you," no, he wouldn't even answer the questions, basically. So while he disapproved of liberalism in the abstract, he cultivated friendships with influential liberals in the hope that peace would prevail. Quote, people are tired and sick of this awful controversy, end quote. He remarked in one of his last sermons, quote, I hope the motto of the ministry of this country will be, quote, quit your fighting and go to work and preach the simple gospel, end quote. Again, that shows the practicality of who he was. Although by the end of his career, his popularity was fading. I don't know how I didn't know that, but anyway, we'll keep on going. Moody's influence was broad and lasting. Scarily a leader in American Protestantism in the next generation, Asim had not at some time been influenced by Moody. He was a transitional figure in an age of rapid change, yet he helped to make some characteristics of that age lasting parts of the revivalist tradition, perhaps as much as Henry Ward Beecher, although in quite different ways. He helped to fuse the spirit of middle-class Victorian America with evangelical Christianity. The next section is Moody and his empire. Moody was a Horatio Alger figure, the honest and industrious boy from a New England village who went to the city to find fame and fortune. Arriving in Boston at the age of 17 in 1854, Moody's first evangelical interests were aroused that is, through contacts with the YMCA, which is called Young Men's Christian Association, an organization that had recently originated in England for evangelism to young men in cities. Moody soon moved to Chicago, where his religious fervor was intensified by the urban revivals of 1857 and 58. By 1860, he decided to give up a promising shoe business to devote himself for full time to YMCA work and to other Christian ministries in the city. So I'm thinking here, so he had to have some money on his pockets here in some ways in order to do this. Okay. He didn't ask for money, so to speak, but apparently he did pretty well in the shoe business. That's what it seems like. And then he decided to get into YMCA work and such and such. Now, people would say in the Christian circles, well, he was called by God. Well, maybe so. I don't think so, because he's what he claims to be. This is not the truth anyway, you see. But we'll continue to read. He started his own Sunday school for poor and immigrant children, and eventually by 1864, organized the Illinois Street Church, a congregation with no denominational ties. In 1866, he became president of the Chicago YMCA and was a locally known evangelistic leader. That is, that the YMCA, rather than any denomination, should be Moody's main formal contact with the Christian community, was indicative of an important tendency in American evangelism, greatly furthered forward by Moody himself. In other words, they were no longer, this was the first time that Moody, not Moody, but other evangelists were not tied to a particular church at this point. That's what he's trying to say here. It's not a church. The YMCA is not a church, okay? It's just an organization. So during the awakening of the first half of the century, a quote, and quote, empire, end quote, of independent evangelical organizations had burgeoning to support home and foreign missions, publications and distribution of Bibles and Christian literature, Sunday schools, charities, and reforms of most of the notorious vices, I should say, like the YMCA. Many of these programs were imported from England. Also, like the YMCA, they were extra ecclesiastical organizations, often with lay leadership, enlisting volunteers to support specific causes. This system encouraged the personal empire building, which developed during Moody's time. Events in the business world of the Gilded Age paralleled this trend and likewise encouraged individual initiation and freedom from centralized regulation. So that's the key. You see, he's basically he's not in a church. He's not starting with a particular religion. He's not a Baptist. He's not a Methodist. He's not a Presbyterian. He's out of that. He was not a part of that. In other words, he didn't have the strings of what we call theological thinking or belief system. So he was in reality not going to be hinged in by any particular church. You see, now I don't know if he decided to do that. That was one of his reasons, but that's what they're pointing out here. So Moody himself follows such a pattern. His success soon took him beyond the YMCA, and although he cultivated cordial relations with all evangelical denominations, he had formally connections with none. Wow. So he didn't have any strings tied to him. I don't know if he just simply was a very wise man in that way. When you think about that, when I say wise man, I just mean simply practical. Many of his associates followed a similar pattern. While most of them retained some formal denominational ties, their strongest allegiance were to a variety of specialized works, revival agencies, prophetic conferences, schools, publications, and local churches. These practices were perpetual in later fundamentalism. Even when denominational concerns continue, the organizational dynamic of the movement was built around individual leaders, not built around religious beliefs, and empires made of agencies dedicated to specific causes. It was a religious structure according to the free enterprise system. You see, and you could almost say it's a business. Okay, just think about that. That's not what I say, but I'm just saying this simply. It could be almost because it's independent. It's not tied to a church. So Moody's own rise to success was spectacular. His YMCA work gave him contacts in England, where he was invited to conduct some modest conceived evangelistic services in 1873, aided by Ira Sankey, Sankey, as song leader. Moody succeeded beyond all expectations. By the end of 1873, they had touched off something akin to the national revival in Scotland, making Moody and Sankey internationally renowned figures. During the next year, they triumphantly toured the British Isles, returning to America in 1875 as national heroes. Now, where did the money come from? That's the question I'm going to ask first. But obviously, there was money in his pockets. Now, again, he must have did really well with his shoe business, or did well in some areas, or there were people who simply believed in this guy. They gave their money to him. So Americans were, of course, immensely impressed by the accomplishments of the American evangelistic institutes abroad. the religious leaders of virtually every American city and clamored for their services. Following his highly successful first round of campaigns in America, Moody turned to building structures that would widely, or I should say widely, but widen and perpetrated his principal concern. Again, evangelism. And evangelism simply means this: going out and telling people the good news. That's what it means. Okay. It's interested in getting people saved, as they would say. All right. Or born again. So his message reflected the influence of his early YMCA connections. The key to the future was to reach and train young people. Okay, so you can see his thinking here. In 1879, he founded a school for girls at his home base in Northfield, Massachusetts. Following in 1881 by the Mount Hermon, Hermon School for boys. In 1886, he gave his support to Emma Dreyer, that's EMMA, Dreyer, Dryer, new Bible training school in Chicago, which he designed for quick Christian training of laymen to meet the needs of urban evangelism. So this is not going out, and I'm just guessing here, but this is not him going out to quote unquote out in the country. This is to do with urban evangelism. He's going to be in city after city, so to speak, whatever. Okay. And he's going to have an entourage of people who are going to sponsor him, so to speak, or set up things for him. So it's a lot different. It's not simply a few guys getting together and putting up a tent. See, there are going to be people out going out in the streets and handing out papers, going to people's houses, so to speak. And it's going to be such and such. And he's going to be here, such and such, as though he's some type of main attraction, so to speak, which is kind of really worrisome when you think about that. But people are drawn to that, you see. And it still is the same way. It is. People are drawn by that. As though they see themselves as pitiful people, which is the wrong way of thinking. But that's what they see. They see this guy having success, so they think, I want a piece of the pie, sort of thinking. That's what it comes across. He's successful. Even the paper said that, you see. In addition, beginning in 1880, he made his home in Northfield the site for summer conferences. Another was the popular new evangelical institutions. At Northfield, a wide variety of Protestant leaders spoke. Although Moody, personality and piety were always dominant. The most significant of the conferences was the inspiring international gathering of students in 1886, which led to the formation of the next summer of the immensely influential student volunteer movement, embodying the missionary enthusiasm of thousands of collegians in America and England for the quote, evangelization of the world in this generation, end quote. So the whole idea here is now becoming more to do with missions, you see, to getting people saved. And someone would say, saved from what? You go, well, they got to preach. One says they have to preach the bad news in order to give you the good news. You see, you're a sinner. No, you're not a sinner. Okay, you're not a sinner. You fell. You fell into the material world because you simply were a spirit, and you incarnated here. That's right. You incarnated here. You will continue to reincarnate here. Okay, until you get it. And so what happens simply is, this is the way they do this. You see, this is how they teach people such and such, and it's a way of getting people thrilled up. It's in this generation. So it's a quick fix, could be almost. Moody's message, though, in the next section, is called the motto of the student volunteer movement. Summarizes exactly the controlling principle in Moody's own thought. Although Moody was not a frankly pragmatic analyst of the techniques of a successful evangelism in the way of Charles Finney had been, he often tested doctrines for their suitability to evangelism. Quote, his system of theology, end quote, explained an early interpreter, end quote, is bounded by his work as an evangelist, end quote. Moody judged his sermons and an interpreter by whether they were, quote, fit to convert sinners with, end quote. Quote, by this rule of fitness, he tests all the ideas which present themselves to his mind, end quote. So I'm wondering here, is he really a good salesman? I mean, think about that. Is that what he is? Now, as far as you know, nothing says this at this point, but I'm just wondering if he's one of those guys that has this gift. Now, remember, he was a shoe salesman, a shoe business, that is. I don't know if he was a shoe salesman. He had a shoe business. But I'm just speculating here. Was he simply a good salesman? You see, to keep it simple, stupid, you see. This test kept Moody's message simple and positive. See, there it is, simple and positive. The 3 R's accurately summarize his central doctrines: ruin by sin, redemption by Christ, and regeneration by the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, end quote. Very simple, isn't it? And this is key with just about everyone these days, folks. They have a routine of a simple statement, like, any particular company has this little statement, or, tire companies, whatever, businesses have this little statement. And it's really even shorter than what is even said here. Moody presents these themes in attractive, informal fashion, primarily through illustrations and anecdotes, often from scriptures, although most of the biblical and evangelical aspects of his message were not new to revival audiences. The one picture that almost everyone noticed was that Moody's emphasized the love of God. There's nothing wrong with that. Moreover, a striking omission, he did not preach hellfire and God's wrath. Okay, so he's not a fire and brimstone type of preacher. Although he never repudiated the doctrine of eternal punishment. His uneasiness with the subject was not far from that of the evangelical liberalism of Henry Ward Beecher. In Moody's case, it appears that he avoided distressing subjects largely because he sensed that because of the mood of the modern age, they did not meet his pragmatic tests. As he himself explained, quote, terror never brought a man in yet, end quote. So this would reveal some of the things. Let me think about some things I can remember in my back. When I took some classes, and it was long ago, I can't remember who it was, but they would call it the burned over district. And this burned over district is what we're called, this is in the upper state, this is the upper part of New York. This is in the area of the Five Fingers area. And I can't remember who the guy is or who was involved, but it was basically this whole idea, as I read when I was back in seminary. They called it the burned over district for a reason. They used a certain thing, what they call the anxious bench. So when you had these camp meetings, evangelical deals, they kept people there a good long time. And they kept playing the music. They kept, in other words, they're trying to get converts. And what happens simply is, this is why it's called a burn over district. These people eventually go forward at the anxious bench and then go forward and choose to want Jesus in their life. But it's the reason why simply it's getting late. It's getting late, guys. I got to go to work tomorrow. You see. And also, this is another thing simply with these camp meetings. These was places where people were clappy type of thing. You see, that's the other thing they did. This was a way of, it wasn't a dirge. It wasn't what you go to churches, what they call dirges, which is just a slow type of thing. No, the issue right takes place in this particular time period. There's the happy clappy music. This takes place after the Civil War. This is one phenomenon that they use to get people to come. They were not listening to what they called these dirges, which are the slow moving music. There was in organs, such and such, just kind of tranquil, would put you to sleep, so to speak. No, they want you to go clap type of thing, get involved. You see, that was a way. Again, it's like advertising. You see, it's a form of advertising, and this is also the time they bring in what we call issue of Sunday school. Sunday school is not always there. That's another thing, another phenomenon that started taking place. That is churches now. This is not a church here. This guy is completely independent. This is similar to Billy Graham, similar to Billy Sunday. You see, even probably Oral Roberts. Although Oral Roberts would go a different way, they would do it in the Coliseum, such and such, more upscale type of thing. But Billy Graham. Before that was Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday is probably the last major one here. I don't know if they deal with this or not, but anyway, I'm getting off the tangent here. But anyway, and Moody's theology was shaped by evangelistic concerns as adjusted to the spirit of the age. Of course it was. This is completely opposite of George Whitefield, which is way back in the 1700s. And I don't think they haven't talked anything about George Whitefield. Whitefield's a completely different animal compared to these guys. Completely. They're willing to use any kind of tool to get someone to become a Christian. And I remember this, and let me explain. This speaks to me because simply this is what I was involved in. When I was 18 years old, I was a part of the Grace Brethren Church. And I was excited to chose between, this was the summertime, so I'd already graduated high school in 78. So this is the summer of 1978. And I'm the only one from my church that goes, and I go to Pennsylvania, and I think it's a 6-week deal. And there were all different young people there, that is, boys and girls. Okay, and I'm trying to think how many it was. There's probably about 25 of us or so. Maybe less, somewhere in that neighborhood, 20, 25. We had 3 leaders. No, we had 4 leaders. We had a couple, husband and wife, and then we had another guy who's a leader, and then there was a woman also who was they were older. So the couple was much younger, probably maybe in the mid-20s. You see. And we would do puppet shows, or we would do skits. See, that was the popular thing beginning to take place, and so that was how we were trying to get people to become Christians. And it's a mood thing. You see, it's the way they've used this tool to get people to change. When in reality, nothing's changing. They're feeling the pressure somewhat in a different way because we're dealing with young people. It's not always to do with older people. You see, if Moody's theology was shaped by evangelistic concerns as adjusted to the spirit of the age, so also was his view of what it meant to be a Christian. The sins emphasized most in his preaching were a rather stereotyped set of notorious vices, such as thoroughly familiar to revivalist audience. In a sermon on, quote, temptation, end quote, to cite a particular clear and characteristic example, he denounced the, quote, 4 great temptations that threaten us today, end quote. 1, the theater. 2, disregard of the Sabbath. 3, Sunday newspapers. 4, atheistic teachings, including evolution. 4. Since Moody's sermons were filled with illustrations from Scripture, they did at times touch on full range of sins, including subtle tendencies as well as notorious vices. He frequently attacked greed, adversity among businessmen, and would warn against putting, quote, other gods, end quote, such as family, wealth, honor, or self before the true God, end quote. Jealousy, envy, self-seeking, irritability, peevishness, and snappishness were also among the sins against which a person should struggle. Still, the theme that prevailed is preaching on sin, and on which the most often dwell were drunkenness and selling liquor. Sabbath breaking, that is, including boating, fishing, hunting, excursions, and using public transportation. Yeah, I can agree with, I can sense what he's saying here, because I don't think, I'm thinking about my parents, and I don't recall us doing anything on Sunday. There was no fishing. We had a boat at one time, but it was never on Sunday. Okay. There was no hunting. We didn't go hunting on Sunday. There were, the only excursions I remember was that we did when I was at a Nazarene church, that we would get together, the boys there with my dad, and we would play baseball. We would find a place to play, which was empty, usually a playground, and we would play baseball. And the other thing's interesting. This place was called War Memorial Park. So this was in Mooresville, North Carolina. I don't know if it's still there. I have no idea. And my dad would go. He pitched, as I recollect, to everybody. And he enjoyed it, which is fine. I had no problem with that. He was my dad. And the rest of the boys came. And there were actually boys that came from the trailer park in front of the church. So this was at the Church of Nazarene at this point. So this is roughly 73, 74, maybe 72, 1972. And I give you these things just to give you an idea. So we did that, but there was no other things, which I never saw that as being wrong. I never had a problem. My dad apparently didn't have a problem with that. But anyway, this is just to give you an idea of, Sabbath breaking, including boating, fishing, hunting, excursions, and using public transportations. Now, I can give you another example later on in my life, when I was at a Presbyterian church in Augusta, which was First Pres, that we were getting together. That's just all of us singles were getting together and playing and doing something on Sunday. And I was admonished by that later on. Someone pulled me to the side and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "We're just getting together to play baseball, such and such, just guys." And some girls came out, such and such, to watch. It was just something we enjoyed doing. And I was recommended by that pretty much big time. And I didn't see anything wrong with it. You see how this becomes what I call legalism. You can see how that becomes, oh, you're not supposed to be having any fun on Sunday. It's God's day. Okay, so you see how that does that, you see. Anyway, I've gotten a little bit off a tangent here. I do want to explain, because this is my background. This is where I grew up in, and it bothers me, you see. I mean, I don't think this happens like this anymore, you see. But this is, I think kids get together and do things on Sunday. There's, I used to get together, you play. Now, see, if I did this now, if I brought a whole group, this is interesting. If I want to go play tennis with me and another guy, or a friend or a girl, play tennis, there was no big deal with that. But if it was a bunch of, guys getting together and playing baseball, that was a different ballgame. And I look forward to that. I was in my 30s, And so, this is the other issue with it becomes a very controlling group, you see. That's what it becomes. So we get off that tangent here. Okay, pandering this lust of the body, end quote. Sins of fallen women. Quote, telling vile stories, end quote. Theater attendance. Quote, worldly amusements, end quote. And disrespect for parents, especially mothers whose hearts would be broken by their children's indulgence in the above vices, end quote. These vices he described as evidence of, quote, of loving, quote, the world, end quote, or worldly pleasures, end quote. A line should be drawn, he said, quote, between the church and the world and every Christians should get both feet out of the world, end quote. Equally important as Moody's preaching to the success of the revivals was the immensely popular singing of Ira Sankey, whose message reinforced Moody's both in sentimentality and content. Sankey's hymns used simple and touching contrasts between sinners lost, wandering, and beleaguered in their sinfulness and the tender love of Christ. One of the most popular hymns, quote, the 90 and 9, end quote, tells of the Savior's love as he makes his blood-stained way through thickets, deserts, and thunder-riven mountains to retrieve one lost sheep. Jesus and home were often virtually equated, as in the similarity popular and even more sentimental. Quote, where is my boy tonight, end quote. A mother's lament for the lost innocence of her wandering boy, a song that incidentally mentions nothing more explicit. Sorry. Christian than the mother, quote, love and prayer, end quote. The famous quote, hold the fort for I am coming, end quote, based on a Civil War incident, and appealing to less passive sentiments, suggesting a similar contrast between a world almost hopelessly beset by sin and the power of Jesus to save. So you can see how they use these very trifling type of ways of, you can see this is also very much a sentimental age. The music is being taught up. And again, Sunday school is being taught now. That was not before. This was outside the church too. This is another thing that what most people don't understand is that D.L. Moody was actually doing these things without any oversee from any particular church, as far as I know. So wholly spiritualized allusions to the Civil War, together with temperaments, hymns such as "Where is my boy tonight?" end quote, were, however, about as close as the Moody Sankey revivals came to explicit social or political questions. Moody, in fact, probably did as much as anyone to set the trend, in brackets, which fit the national mood of the 1870s and 1880s, away from earlier 19th century evangelical emphasis on the directly social dimensions of sin and holiness. This shift was quite intentional for Moody, who in the YMCA and city work had at first adopted the common evangelical idea that charity and evangelism should naturally go together, as he reportedly remarked in a frequently quoted statement. When I was at work for the city relief system or society or the fire, I used to go to a poor center with the Bible in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. My idea was that I could open a poor man's heart by giving him a loaf of bread or a ton of coal when the winter was coming on. But I soon found out that he wasn't any more interested in the gospel on that account. Instead of thinking how he could come to Christ, he was thinking how long it would be before he got the load of wood. Well, he brought him that. It's interesting. You see, in other words, you're trying to manipulate him. That's what you're doing. If I had the Bible in one hand and a loaf in the other, the people always looked first at the loaf, and that was just the contrary of the order laid down in the gospel. So this is just something he shared, but this just gives you an idea. That's what many people are asking. People who are homeless. So what's the catch? Okay. In other words, that's what you would think. What's the catch? You have me here. See, why don't you just, if you really care about me, just simply give me a loaf of bread. Okay. There is no strings attached. You see, you're not being genuine. Okay. You're here trying to, again, force something to make it happen when it's never going to happen in the first place. It's not going to be real, but then this is not the way the gospel is in the first place neither. So this is another, I can go all over the place this way, because frankly, all these people, these churches are not, no one's getting saved here, folks. Hello? No one. No one. That's the truth. No one. No matter if you bring the bread, loaf, bring the coal, whatever, the wood, whatever, there's nothing changing here. Hello? Stop playing games. Moody dropped direct social involvement for the same reason that he avoided controversial theology, both threatening to distract from his primary concern for evangelism. In his mind, it was certainly not a question of condoning a lack of compassion for the poor. Rather, he was convinced that the most compassionate possible care was for a person's eternal soul. You know, it sounds good, doesn't it? It does sound good, doesn't it? It's a good story, but it's not true. You see, it's not true. He's deceived. See, he's been deceived, just like Billy Sunday, Billy Graham. All these guys are deceived. They're slick salesmen, you see. Furthermore, evangelism was, according to his theology, the best way to meet social needs. But if you want to meet social needs, you don't need to bring something else, a Bible, you see, unless you can really explain it. Unless you can explain it like Phil Langdon can. And some people would say, well, that's kind of derogative. No, it's not. It's just simply as he speaks the truth. They're metaphors of the Bible, Ken. Anyway, conversion inevitably led to the personal responsibility and moral uplift, qualities which the conventional wisdom said the poor most often lack. Well, the emphasis on motherhood and domesticity in Moody's preaching was part of the widespread evangelical conviction that stability in the home was the key to the resolution of other social problems. Well, yeah, that's correct. But it would be best it's not a spiritual thing here. It's a psychological problem, you see, with the husband and wife, and the children. Once wandering came, quote, home, end quote, and the poor acquired a sense of responsibility found in strong Christian families, poverty would cease. So individual conversions would eventually bring social reform. The context of Moody's remark on his own charge, or own change, it says with the biblical statement, quote, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you, end quote. Nothing in Moody's views on personal or social questioning was out of the ordinary and middle-class individualism of the day. Moody rose to fame in his heyday of American individualism, and his thought is prevailed by his assumptions. The sins he stressed were personal sins, not involving victims besides oneself and members of one's family. The sinner stood alone before God. The Christian community provided emotional support, encouragement, and example. But ultimately, the decision to accept the message of salvation was, in the democratic America and in what we call an Armenian tradition, essentially the decision of each individual, as was the decision to conquer sin. Quote, whatever the sin is. Moody exhorted in a typical statement, quote, make up your mind that you will gain victory over it, end quote. Now, let's take something here what he says here. This is interesting what he talks about here that George M. Marson says. This is a completely different perspective. When he says here, let me explain here. He says, in the democratic America, an Armenian tradition. And most of you would have no idea what they're saying about Armenian. Okay, so this is the difference between what we call Arminius. Jacob Arminius, his name was in the past, was at that time long ago, was what we call free will. So the idea here when we talk about Armenian is that in other words, you can make up your own mind, okay, and make a decision, okay? I'm just explaining this. Calvinists would say no. Now, Calvinists would say something a different perspective. They would say God chose you either to be a Christian or not a Christian before you were even born here. That's what they would teach. That's what they teach. And they are, in reality, Calvinism is taught almost all over the place now. Arminianism is hardly even around. But I'm not even agreeing with either one of them because they're both wrong. Okay. But Arminianism was what I would call more to do with free will, meaning that the person there. But the problem with simply is nothing happens still because it didn't do the great work. It wasn't a one-time thing. You see, that's what people get completely confused. People think Just because I make one decision, I'm going to heaven. Okay. And that's a very much pragmatic Christianity here in America. That was not the same story back in 1500s. You see. And even they got it wrong. Okay. Scripture says very clear there are only a few. It doesn't say the many. It says the few. A few is a few. It's not a many. This is where people get confused. Because they're looking again, what I'm called, looking into what they've been taught by a preacher who is actually, most preachers who teach the Bible today come from the same background. So if they grow up a Presbyterian, they're going to teach Calvinistic theology. And if they're brought up in a Baptist church, if it's not Reformed, which would be somewhat leaning towards Arminianism, that would say have free will. So I talked with someone a couple of weeks ago. The whole idea we talked about was kind of interesting. If I can remember the conversation. The idea is that simply is not that Presbyterians don't, quote unquote, evangelize people or have missions, okay? But the problem simply is they believe that simply is that there's some, if they accept, it's God's elect. And if they don't, it wasn't God's elect. And they would also, in a way, would say it only takes place, you only have one chance to do this. You have one chance in one lifetime. And it's over for you. Because see, they don't believe in reincarnation. They believe in all these churches, all the way around us here, believe it's just one and done. That's a lie. That's a lie. You see, and that's why they hurry up and do what they do. See, they have their pragmatic thinking here, and then when they do, simply it's okay. So, they may be elect or not, so we're going to quote unquote try to go and missionize them. And I have former friends who are involved in this. Okay. And they would give the other idea simply is backsliding. No, you won't backslide. You won't backslide because there's something very real that happened. The sad part simply is anyone who accepts this type of thing, they will backslide because nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing. It's the greatest psyop if I ever seen one. It's a psychological manipulation of people. It fools people. And they give their money, their time, whatever, and they think they're going into the kingdom of God. It's a lie. It's a fucking lie. And people will struggle with the word I just used. Oh, he's cursing. Yeah, I grew up in that type of family. I grew up, you're not supposed to curse. Oh, that's something really bad, No. The intention here simply is to wake you up and say something's wrong here. That's what it's about. It's wrong. These people are deceiving you. And you're giving money to the churches. He also taught premillennialism, which would be, I'll do a teaching on that sometime, okay? I want to do that because in premillennialism is whole idea of rapture, all that is all false. It's a clever way to what they look at the Bible. It's all false. Influential new forms of each of these teachings were also promoted through closely related movements organized in America by the same people as Moody's closest friends and younger lieutenants, such as including Reuben Torrey, Torrey, James M. Gray, C.I. Schofield, which is later on, William J. Erdman, E-R-D-M-A-N, George Nealon, A.C. Dixon, and A.J. Gordon. These movements and these men, as we shall see, had a great deal to do with shaping fundamentalism. Of the two related movements, Moody was more directly involved with promoting the holiness teaching. Holiness was a central emphasis at his Northfield conferences, and he published 2 books loosely presenting the new teaching with respect to premillennialism, a more divisive issue. He was careful to avoid the doctrinal and partisan spirit of the movement, although he preached regularly on the subject, and many of Sankey's hymns dealt generally with the theme. Moody never endorsed the details of the new dispensation version of premillennialism. Premillennialism did, however, give shape to the general outlook of the new evangelism Moody was promoting. You see, he went along with the wagon, you see. He professed to be attracted to it because its pessimistic view of culture gave a strong impetus to evangelism. In other words, how you look at the thing here pessimistically leads to what they do. Instead of saying simply, okay, this person's been here, he's here, and is he going to change? No, he may not, may do, such and such. You'll have another opportunity when he's born. Once he dies, he comes back. Same thing. He learns such and such. That's God's long suffering. That's God's grace. That's what that is. Not this hurry up stuff here. This is a salesman type of shit. This is how they fool people. You should be angry. You think politicians are bad. These guys are worse than politicians in a lot of ways because they deceive people immensely. Because they use fear. They use fear. The only hell you're going to is the hell we're here on this planet. This is the real hell, folks. Premillennialism did, however, give shape to the general outlook of the new event, such and such. I've said that he professed to be attracted to it because it was a pessimistic view. That's just what it said. It's a pessimistic view of culture. Gave a strong impetus to evangelism. So his most quoted statement, which summarizes philosophy of evangelism, appears to the context of a standard sermon on the return of Christ. Quote, I look upon this world as a wretched vessel. He said, quote, God has given me a lifeboat and said to me, Moody, save all you can, end quote. Did he really get that from God? No. It's his belief system. It's a belief system. It's a belief system. It's also self-righteousness, isn't it? The view that, quote, the world, end quote, would grow, quote, grow worse and worse, end quote, was an important departure from the dominant tradition of American evangelism that viewed God's redemptive work as manifested in the spiritual and moral progress of American society. So this is again, is fear-based. This is what this is. Grow worse and worse. Are you going to hell? Are you going to hell? No, you're not going to hell. You're already here, you see. Look around you. But see, this is how it is. So if someone goes forward in a service thinking that simply they're becoming Christians and thinking such and such, but then, they have this enthusiasm for, a few years, such and such, and suddenly they just sort of fall away. And then you say, well, they really never were Christians in the first place. Well, that's true. None of them were never Christians, even the ones that are still there. The departure was by no means complete. The separation from the world that was demanded was not radically outward as in the Anabaptist tradition, you see. So the Anabaptists are what we call Hutterites, um, Amish, and Mennonites. And they are separatists. They're far more separatists. In fact, it says it's rather an inner separation marked by the outward signs of a life free from specific vices. In other words, Anabaptism, Mennonites, there's a close continuity there. They would be almost accused back in the 1500s as being communists. They had a community. That's what the word basically is. They're a community of people. That's what Amish and Mennonites were. Mennonites are no longer that way. Most of them now more loosely, but even some Amish are that way. But if you look at the back of the history of Amish, they've always been, they're separatists. They see the world, again, as a bad place. And so they separate themselves from everything. Despite the hopeless corruption of the world, there was no demand to abandon most of the standards of the respectable American middle-class way of life. It was to these standards, in fact, that people were to be converted. Moody was quite ambivalent towards American culture and its prospects. So he never gave up. For instance, the 19th century American evangelist hoped that the Republic of Virtue could be saved by the revival. Quote, revival, end quote. He declared in 1899 in a statement that might just as well have come from Timothy Dwight. Tim Dwight, I think, was a former president of Yale, if I recall, or Lyman Beecher in the outset of the Second Great Awakening in 1801. Is the only hope for our republic. Quote, is the only hope for our republic, for I don't believe that a Republican form of government can last without righteousness, end quote. Moody remained hopeful that American culture would not become increasingly worse. Quote, I think it's getting very dark, end quote. He said in the same 1899 sermon. But don't think for a moment I am pessimist. Pentecost isn't over yet. The revival of 57 isn't over yet by a good deal. Some of the best men we have in the churches now were brought out in 57. Why shouldn't we have now, in the close of this old century, a great shaking up and mighty wave from heaven? Moody's central place in the heritage of fundamentalism suggests an important aspect of his character, shaped by a fondness neither for controversy nor for precise formation of doctrine and the details of prophetic history. In other words, he just created his own thing, so to speak. I mean, he pulled what he wanted to pull out, what he wanted to teach, so to speak, which is, again, another problem. Fundamentalism was always a subspecies of the larger revivalist movement, and such it has always involved an ambivalent attitude towards American culture, which evangelism has done much to shape. So here's the deal, let me finish it up first, and I'll share it with you. When the battles against modernism arose, fundamentalism always retained a tension between exclusive militants and an Irenaean spirit concerned with holiness and saving souls. These later elements in the tradition of Moody gave the movement its largest appeal. Yet when the organization and vocal core of the militants attempted to speak for the host of the true evangelists, indeed even to lead them into battle, as in the 1920s, the ranks sometimes seemed to disperse. As for Moody, so probably for the majority of the sympathizers of the anti-modernist movement, evangelism and the next revival were always the chief aim. And I want to share this because a lot of this is where I came out of. Now, as well as I recall, so I'm going to think about these things and back to my childhood, because a lot of this has to do with my childhood. It's very much a part of that. And so the Baptist church did, as far as I know, when I was a kid, when I went to church when I was a little boy, as a child, there were Baptist churches. My parents were involved in Southern Baptist to roughly 1966 to 67. And then my dad got involved with the Independent Baptist Church. In fact, he was involved and inspirational in starting a church there. That's what he started. In fact, there were people who came to our house who agreed in some ways with what my dad was doing. And so there were families that came there at our house. There were maybe 4 or 5 families, as I recall, and I remember their names. And so that continued on until he decided to do something and started meeting in a particular place near what we call South Iredale. If anybody knows where South Iredale Fire Department is, that's pretty much where we started at as a child. I remember that. I can remember simply hating that place because simply it was a concrete floor. I had to wear dress shoes, so basically my feet were frozen. That is during the wintertime. And that's where eventually we had a guy come in from Tennessee Temple, pastor, Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Church. And that's be the calling card in a lot of ways to do with different types of approach here with my own life, you see. So, this is a lot to do with me, but it's also to do with a lot of people who just don't understand. Okay. And a lot of it began, like I said, when I was in Athens. I can tell you the moment, what happened. I'm not going to go into the details, but at 4 years old, I was threatened. I took it personally. I was going to hell. It scared the shit out of me. Okay. It's a psychological tool, guys. Tell them the bad news. Okay. Tell them the bad news. The bad news isn't even correct at all. In other words, these people are spending a lot of time they're throwing their lives away for nothing. They haven't met anything, haven't touched anything. They just want to be included in a small group, so to speak. You see, it's very scary. It's like circling a wagon, like a wagon, and dealing with Indians. It's just that type of deal. They are preying upon children. They're preying upon children to keep them in fear, you see. So they'll be good little people, and they'll continue to get involved with the church and stay there for the rest of their lives when nothing really ever happened to them. But they'll come up to them and hug them, the parishioners there, which are also fooled. They are. They're all fooled. So anyway, thank you for being here. I'm quite direct about it. I'm very straightforward about it because I see it for what it is. No one should go through something of this nature at all. Shouldn't at all. And as far as I know that Tennessee Temple School is closed as far as I know of. Good. The other school was also involved was Bob Jones University also. So the pastor that my dad was involved with and a couple other people, he came from Tennessee Temple School. That's where he came from. It's not a seminary, you see. And I don't even know if it would have credentials today at all. But I know simply is no longer involved. And I believe simply is the public has had enough in that direction, in that area, because of that. In fact, I think the public is becoming very, very much away from the church. And there's a good reason for that. Not because, a lot of it's to do with simply is fooling people. Yeah, fooling people. They use all kinds of psychology upon young people. And we'll stop there again. Again, thank you for being here. Part of this is just simply, I wouldn't want anyone to go through what I went through, but then I went through all this to basically come through learning as much as I can about how I've been deceived. So have a good day. Take care. Talk to you soon.